At 70 years old, Michael Anthony no longer speaks with bitterness in his voice, only the weight of memory. He's lived long enough to watch his legacy get rewritten, reshaped, and sometimes erased by people he once called brothers. Today, when he finally opens up about Eddie Van Halen, not just the guitarist but the man behind the legend, he doesn't do it to settle scores. He does it because history was twisted, the truth was bent, and somewhere along the line, the band that changed rock and roll became a battlefield of egos, addictions, insecurity, and betrayal. This is not the story of a band. This is the story of how one man spent decades being loyal to another who slowly pushed him out of the picture and how that loyalty became his greatest wound. This is Michael Anthony exposing Eddie Van Halen, not to tear him down but to finally tell what really happened. To understand the fracture, you have to start at the beginning, before the fame and before the arenas echoed with Eddie's runaway guitar tapping. Michael Anthony was not just a bassist standing at the back of the stage, he was the glue. His thunderous low end, his unmatched high harmony vocals, and his easygoing presence held Van Halen together when everyone else was tearing at the seams. Even people who don't know his name know his voice. Those soaring high harmonies on Panama, Running with the Devil, Dance the Night Away, and Ain't Talkin' 'Bout Love, they were Michael. They defined the sound, they were essential. But the world didn't know how essential until they were gone. Because for years, Eddie Van Halen made sure the spotlight stayed on himself. He was the genius, he was the prodigy, he was the one rewriting the guitar handbook. And yes, he was. No one disputes Eddie's brilliance. Michael Anthony never did, not once. But genius often has a shadow, and Eddie's shadow was insecurity, jealousy, and a growing resentment toward the one bandmate who never challenged him. Michael was not flashy, Michael was not confrontational, Michael did not demand credit. But sometimes, the quiet one is the one who ends up paying the highest price. Then came 1978, the debut album, A New Era in Rock. Van Halen detonated into the industry. While David Lee Roth drew eyes and Eddie drew awe, it was Michael's harmonies and sense of rhythm that shaped the identity of the band. Producers knew, engineers knew, fans knew even if they didn't know his name. Van Halen sounded like Van Halen because of all four men, not just one, and for a while it worked. The early years were wild, loud, chaotic, dangerous, but they were bonded. There was trust, there was laughter, there was brotherhood. But success changes people, fame feeds insecurity, and addiction can turn brilliance into paranoia. By the early 1980s, Eddie Van Halen was drinking heavily, and Michael, the loyal friend, was drinking right beside him, not because he wanted to lose control, but because when your brother spirals, sometimes you spiral with him. It felt like loyalty at the time. Later, it felt like a mistake. Then came 1985. David Lee Roth leaves, the band fractures, the entire world predicts Van Halen is finished. And what does Michael do? He stays, he stands by Eddie, he supports bringing in Sammy Hagar, and the impossible happens, the band becomes even bigger than before. Van Halen becomes Van Hagar, and the harmonies, Michael's harmonies, are now even more essential. Sammy has said many times Michael was the key to that era. Without him, the songs would not have sounded the same. Eddie knew this, but acknowledging someone's importance is different from appreciating them. As the years went on, Eddie's drinking worsened, arguments became constant. Eddie began criticizing Michael's playing, something he had never done before. He told others Michael was just lucky to be there. He publicly minimized him. And Michael stayed. He stayed through humiliation. He stayed through silence. He stayed because Van Halen was his life. Then in the early 2000s, everything truly collapsed. Eddie was barely functional. The 2004 reunion tour with Sammy Hagar was a disaster behind the scenes. Eddie was angry on stage, sloppy, explosive. Michael was the peacekeeper again, the quiet one who kept the machine running, but his loyalty wasn't enough anymore. In 2006, Michael Anthony received the news that felt like a knife. He was being replaced. Eddie Van Halen replaced him with his own son Wolfgang, a move that was framed as family unity. But the silent message was clear. Michael was no longer part of the family, not just the band, the family. Michael had played with Eddie for nearly 30 years. He had defended him, protected him, waited out every storm, and his reward was exile. But the deepest cut wasn't being replaced. It was what Eddie did next. Eddie began rewriting history, claiming Michael had never contributed musically, claiming he didn't write bass lines, claiming he didn't deserve his royalties, claiming he wasn't even a real part of the band. Michael stayed quiet for years. He didn't attack, he didn't fire back, he let the world believe whatever it wanted. Because sometimes the truth hurts too much to speak. But time changes things, time heals some wounds, time reveals others. And at 70 years old, Michael finally began to talk. He spoke of Eddie not as the myth, but as the man broken, brilliant, tortured, impossible, and extraordinary. He spoke of the pain of being pushed out. He spoke of the heartbreak of being erased. And he spoke of something the world never understood. Michael never stopped loving him, even when Eddie turned away, even when Eddie cut him out, even when Eddie died in 2020 and the final conversation between them would remain unfinished forever. Michael still carries that silence like a weight. Because some betrayals don't end with apology. They end with time running out. When Michael Anthony finally started speaking openly, he didn't speak with the venom the fans expected. He didn't tear Eddie apart. Instead, he spoke with the hesitancy of someone who has replayed the story in his mind 1,000 times and still isn't sure where it all went wrong. He said the hardest part wasn't being replaced. It was realizing that somewhere along the line, Eddie stopped seeing him as a brother. He spoke about the joy that had once been the foundation of the band, and how slowly, quietly, painfully, that joy was poisoned by resentment, ego, and the kind of silent wounds that grow in the dark. Because the truth is, Van Halen was never just a band. It was a family, not just figuratively, but literally. It was Eddie and Alex, two brothers bound together by music and blood, and Michael was the one allowed into that circle. For decades, he believed that circle was unbreakable. But when trust is based on one person holding themselves together and that person begins to unravel, the circle shatters and everyone inside gets cut. Michael didn't just lose a job. He lost a family, he lost a brother. He lost a piece of himself that he can never get back. And the fracture didn't happen all at once. It started slowly. A comment here, a decision there, Eddie's increasing control over the band, Eddie's studio becoming the only place music could be written, Eddie pushing out collaborators who didn't agree with him, Eddie wanting the band to be not a group but an extension of himself. And Michael was easy to overlook, easy to dismiss. He didn't fight, he didn't push back. And in a world where ego roared louder than talent, the quietest voice gets drowned out first. There was a moment Michael mentions, small but telling. He remembers a time when Eddie looked at him and said, "You should be grateful you're even here." It wasn't said in anger, it wasn't shouted, it was said like a simple fact, like gravity, like truth. And Michael realized in that instant that the brotherhood was gone. Eddie didn't see him as an equal anymore. He saw him as a passenger on his ship, but the world didn't know that. The world still believed in the myth of unity. The story of four guys who changed music together. And Michael, loyal to the very end, protected that myth, even when it no longer included him. Then came the part fans still talk about. The rewriting of history. Eddie began publicly claiming Michael didn't deserve songwriting credit. He said Michael did not contribute creatively. He said Michael's bass parts could have been played by anyone, but engineers and producers who were there tell a different story. They remember the sessions. They remember the way Michael locked the rhythm in place, the way he created the foundation Eddie relied on to build his sonic explosions. They remember Eddie saying early on that Michael was the best player he had ever worked with. But addiction changes memory, ego rewrites truth, and time reshapes stories to fit the pain of the person telling them. Fans noticed something else too. When Michael was gone, the sound changed. The harmonies, the unmistakable high, ringing harmonies were gone. Wolfgang played the notes, he played them well. He is a talented musician, gifted in his own right. But Van Halen no longer sounded like Van Halen. Something essential had been removed. The band had been altered at the molecular level. And suddenly everyone understood. Michael Anthony was not the background, he was the spine. But even after being pushed out, Michael refused to attack Eddie. He refused to air dirty laundry. He refused to turn pain into spectacle. And he has said more than once that he hoped one day they would talk. One day they would sit down. One day they would clear the air the way only brothers can. But that day never came. When Eddie Van Halen died in October 2020, the world mourned a once-in-a-century talent. Guitars wept. Fans sobbed. The music world stood still. And behind all of that, Michael Anthony sat with a grief far more complicated than public tribute. Because mourning someone you love is difficult. But mourning someone you loved who hurt you is something else entirely. It is a wound that opens twice, once in memory and once in loss. Michael didn't attend the funeral. Some people use that to create rumors, narratives, blame, but the truth is simpler. The family didn't call him, the wound was never resolved. Even in death, the silence remained. And yet when Michael speaks about Eddie today, there is no hatred. None. There is sorrow, there is nostalgia, there is gratitude, and yes, there is regret, but there is no bitterness. Because Michael Anthony understands something most people never learn. Sometimes the person who hurts you most is the person you would still drop everything for if they called. There is one moment that Michael has never forgotten. Years before the split, before the replacements, before the bitterness took over, Eddie had come to him late at night after a show. The crowd was long gone, the lights were off, the stadium empty, and Eddie, exhausted and raw, said, "We did something no one else did, didn't we?" It wasn't bragging, it wasn't boastful, it was vulnerable, it was real. And Michael looked at him and said, "Yeah, we did." Two men, two friends, two brothers, standing in the dark after the world had already gone home. That moment is the one Michael keeps. Not the anger, not the exile, not the silence. Because sometimes the truth is this: you can love someone who breaks your heart. And Michael Anthony's heart was broken, but he still chooses love. But to truly understand the depth of what Michael Anthony went through, you have to go back to where the cracks first began to show, not in the music, not on the tour but in the small, quiet shifts of personality that happen when pressure, expectations, and addiction begin to twist a person from the inside out. Eddie Van Halen wasn't always volatile. He wasn't always guarded. In the early days, he was shy, humble, and almost insecure about his own playing. He played his guitar facing the wall during rehearsals because he didn't want others to see how he was doing what he was doing. He was a genius, yes, but a fragile one. And Michael understood that fragility. He never tried to compete. He never tried to overshadow. He supported. He gave Eddie room to grow, to evolve, to rise. The first real fracture came when Eddie began building his home studio 5150. This was where control shifted irreversibly. Before 5150, Van Halen was a band writing in a room together. After 5150, Van Halen became Eddie's laboratory, and Eddie controlled everything inside it: who played, what parts were used, who was allowed input, who even got to hear the tracks. Michael saw the shift and didn't fight it. He tried to adapt. But when you place all the power in one person's hands, the band stops being a band. It becomes a kingdom. And Michael was no longer part of the ruling class. Then came the late 90s and early 2000s when the band went silent and Eddie's addiction took over every part of his life. Michael tried to reach him. He tried to check in. Calls went unanswered. Bridges burned quietly. Eddie wasn't pushing him away intentionally. He was retreating into himself. But the impact was the same. Michael found himself on the outside of a life he had helped build. And then came the moment that would change everything. Van Halen was planning a reunion with Sammy Hagar in 2004. The fans were thrilled. The world was ready. But when Michael showed up, he discovered he was no longer considered a member. He was told he could join the tour, but only if he accepted a reduced paycheck and signed over rights to future royalties. Michael could have walked away, most musicians would have, but he didn't, because the band meant more to him than money. It meant brotherhood, it meant loyalty, it meant history. So he signed. He sacrificed not just income, but legacy. And Eddie still resented him. Eddie saw Michael's presence as a reminder of everything he couldn't control: loyalty, stability, friendship, balance. Things Eddie had lost hold of within himself. And when people lose themselves, they often push away the ones who knew them before the mask. So when the tour ended, Eddie replaced Michael with Wolfgang. His son, his blood. A symbolic move, yes, but also a defensive one, because family doesn't leave. Family doesn't challenge the narrative. Family doesn't remind you of what you used to be. But the fans noticed immediately. They noticed the sound was different. They noticed the missing warmth. They noticed that something deep and structural was gone. Because Van Halen was never just Eddie's riffs. It was the combination of forces, 4 personalities, 4 energies, 4 voices converging. And when you remove one of those, the alchemy breaks. For years, Michael stayed silent. Not because he was afraid, but because he respected the legacy more than his own pride. He understood the value of myth. He understood the power of memory. And he refused to be the one to tear down what millions of fans loved. But silence has weight. And when silence is used to erase you, eventually you either speak or disappear. So Michael began telling the truth. Not loudly, not angrily, not in tabloid headlines, but in quiet interviews when asked. He explained how hurt he was when Eddie claimed he didn't deserve songwriting credit. He explained how painful it was to be written out of the band's history. He explained that the greatest loss was not the job, but the friendship, the love, the brotherhood. He said the real tragedy wasn't that they fought. It was that they never got the chance to heal. When Eddie passed in 2020, Michael was hit with a grief far more complex than the world could see. It wasn't just mourning a musician. It was mourning the version of Eddie he had known, the smiling, soft-spoken kid who used to stay up all night playing guitar because he believed music was the purest language there was. Michael mourned that Eddie, the Eddie before the fame, before the pressure, before the pain. And Michael has said publicly with a quiet sadness that he wishes they could have had just one more conversation, one moment to let the past breathe. One moment to let the bitterness fall away. One moment to remember that before the world, before the tour, before the legacy, they were just kids in a garage, making something beautiful together. Michael didn't hate Eddie. He never did.